Oh, it just kicked you to listen only mode apparently, so maybe you can throw that or I can throw that.
Well, you can hear me, can't you?
I can hear you.
Okay, well, I actually think that for some reason I didn't press start, but that this has started. So, good. That's good.
And you can see my screen now?
I can see your screen perfectly. If you need me for anything, go to the chat and send the message right to me. Or you can just say it out loud. If you want to say something, I mean, I can hear you.
I'll just panic. I'll say, Nancy, help!
And I'll do it right back to you.
Oh, well, how was your day? Did you have an okay day? Were you out and about, or?
I was. I had a wonderful day. Yeah. I had a great day. Let me just see. And no, I got everything. Everything's good. So what I think is we've got almost like 10 minutes before people come on, because I don't know if there's anyone on. Just you and me. Just you and me.
Yeah, that's what it looks like. How many people, do you know how many people were signed up offhand?
Last I counted 31.
Oh, nice. And how does that, is that average or normal or low or high? Or?
No, that's okay. That's average. We've had a good turnout. Yeah, we've had a good turnout. I think, as I'm saying to you, that we're live and we're being recorded. Okay, because I didn't press start webinar. Perhaps you did. It doesn't matter. But I think that well, we've got 10 minutes to wait for people.
Well, would you rather stop all this and start all over again in a few minutes?
No. This is perfect. We're ready to go.
Okay. And you're in New York, right?
I am. I'm in New York.
And which part? Upstate or down around New York?
I'm in the Hudson Valley.
Oh.
Yeah.
Right there in the thick of it all.
Well, I don't know if there's a thick of it all, but I'll tell you, it's been in the 40s at night. So it's a little chilly for me, but it is what it is.
Fall has arrived.
I wasn't in a hurricane, so I'm grateful.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to see if there's a way that I can find, okay, to stop because we're recording. And that means when we send it to members, they're going to get all of this. So
well, I wonder.
Wait, do you see it?
I wonder about the ability to just edit it afterwards and just chop off a front part.
We're definitely going to work on that. But do you happen to see it on your screen? Because now you have control as the organizer. Up on the top right, it says start recording. Do you see that at all?
I'm looking, so there's file and options. That gets rid of that. People can hear you click. People can see your screen. I'm showing my screen.
Because there is a place on the start recording, okay, because you'll see there's going to be a red dot. It says this session is being recorded, that there's a button to pause.
Oh, there it is. There it is.
Good evening and welcome to ADMC's Wednesdays Educational Series. My name is Nancy Crossan and I'm the Director of Education. Before I welcome our presenter, I want to let you know a few things. One is that you're muted. 2 is you can type in your questions. And 3 is Tim will answer your questions at the end of his presentation. Tonight, we have our very own ADMC member, Tim Twigg, presenting today's human resources and employment compliance risk. Tim Twigg is the president of Bent Erickson and Associates. He has been the leading authority in human resources and personnel management in the healthcare industry, helping dentists successfully deal with the ever-changing and complex labor laws. Tim brings over 30 years of practice management and business consulting experience and knowledge specifically in the healthcare field. Tim's expertise extends to leadership and business development, strategic planning and marketing, and communication skills. He has presented seminars nationally on practice management, human resources, and employment compliance. Welcome, our very own Tim Twigg.
Thank you so much, Nancy, and welcome to all of my other fellow Academy members. So tonight, as Nancy said, our focus is going to be on human resources and employment compliance, and more specifically, we're going to look at that from a future and looking at what you need to be aware of about what's coming down the path that can be affecting you and affecting your clients. One of the things when we talk about the future of human resources is people have to really start viewing employees as a resource and not as an expense. It really is a human resource. A lot of resources come to bear to support the success in dental practice. There's financial resources and technology, overhead control, all the various systems, but employees truly are a resource and need to be viewed more from a positive perspective rather than from a perspective of just this necessary evil that the practice has. The other aspect about human resources is that it really represents a risk management and an asset protection element for the practice. And when we talk about risk management, here are just some headlines out of some national headlines that are dental specific about the kind of risks that exist for dental practices. In addition to that, here's a question for you to all play with just for a moment. Your client has a policy prohibiting employees from talking about their pay with other employees. Can your client fire an employee for posting about pay on Facebook? Another question, a flaky employee keeps forgetting to clock in and out. Can the office manager not pay the employee for the hours worked but not listed on the timesheet? Well, the answers to both of those questions, no and no. In the first case, about posting on Facebook or other social media sites, the National Labor Relations Board passed a National Labor Relations Act, which actually protects that kind of activity that employees can talk about wages, working conditions, and benefits, and an employer cannot take any adverse or disciplinary action against them. And relative to clocking in and out, if someone forgets to do that, even though they're a little flaky, if the employer truly knows that the time was worked, or the office manager knows that the time was worked, the FLSA requirements stipulate that you still do indeed have to pay that person. In terms of some of the trending statistics as it relates to HR, the average out-of-court settlement in dentistry today is now running about $25,000. If your client gets into a he said, she said with one of the employees, the dentist loses a little over 85% of the time. Relative to suits or labor and law-related issues, today, statistically, a dentist is more likely to be sued for a labor-related issue than actually be sued for malpractice. That's how ugly the trending is. And there's a specific type of insurance, it's called employment practices liability insurance, that a dentist can have. And this specific type of labor law insurance, the costs now for that are exceeding the costs of malpractice. Other trending statistics, there's going to be more regulatory compliance requirements in the future, not less. There's federal rules and laws, there's state rules and laws, counties are getting into the act, and so are cities. And so, of course, then there has to be this interplay between all of these different ones to determine which one you have to follow. If some of you are sitting around thinking, well, you always follow the feds because Fed trumps state, county, and city, or some other variation of that thinking, the reality is that the dentist has to follow whichever law or rule is considered the most stringent. So if that's the county one, then you have to follow that regardless of what the federal rule or law is or the state rule or law is. So you have to determine which one is the most stringent, and by definition, that means the one that most favors the employee. And of course, as a practice grows and they have more employees, then naturally the HR risks go up. There is also a piece in the HR world called employee thresholds, and this is about applicability, and the thresholds are going down, which means the point where compliance and applicability come into play are going up. When we talk about employee thresholds, this really means the total employee count, and that means both part-time and full-time employees. It's not just full-time, or you don't count the part-time. You've got to count everyone, all part-time and full-time employees. And it's what determines applicability. There's also stipulations about if a practice has multi-locations, an orthodontic practice that has 3 or 4 locations, these locations have to be taken into account, the mileage range, and it'll even cross over state boundaries to get the accurate employee count. Legal structure and ownership also comes into play, the legal entities when you have more than one location. In addition to that, of course, as a practice grows, delegation will have to take place. Clearly, if we're talking about a single practitioner with only 4 or 7 employees, the whole HR thing still has risks, but okay, they can navigate through it usually because the doctor is kind of right there and has a really strong relationship with each of the employees. But you get to a point where there's 11, 15, 27, 35 employees. Number one, the dentist cannot know everything at that point that's going on. There will have to be some delegation of roles, and with that, it becomes critical to make sure that you got the right people in the right seats. This starts to rear the head of employee retention and how important that is to create long-term employees so there is stability without the revolving door turnover that otherwise might take place. And again, as the practice grows, certain rules and regulations are going to come into play that weren't before. Examples are the Americans with Disabilities Act and Pregnancy Discrimination Act and COBRA and Continuation Insurance and Family Medical Leave Act, just as a couple of examples. And like I said earlier, states, counties, and cities get their mitts in the game, and invariably their thresholds will be even lower. In terms of some evolving trends that I think would be good for you to be aware of and plan for, some of these affect hiring and recruiting. Some that you'll hear me talk about affect how you manage current and existing employees, and then of course some will affect how you go about ending employment with someone if indeed that becomes necessary. So in terms of some evolving trends, one of them is the ban the box legislation. Many of you are familiar with applications, and a common box on an application is that little check box where it says, no, I've never been convicted of a felony, or yes, I've been convicted of a felony. Legislation now exists in many states, and the federal government is even considering legislation that will ban the use of this. We have already evolved to a place of eliminating that from applications just in anticipation of that. Equal pay, as many of you are reading about and hearing about on the news, is also a big trend, and it's not about the title. I can say, okay, this person is an office manager, but this person is a business manager, therefore it's different. It's not about title, it's more about the actual essential functions that people do. Other legislation that is in process is legislation that is going to limit or restrict the ability to ask someone about their salary history. And again, this circles back to the equal pay piece, because just because someone had wages that might have been artificially depressed or lower in a previous job shouldn't be something that is held against them if the prevailing wage at a new or different job would otherwise be higher. The 1099 enforcement, some people, dentists in particular, try to do a little slip and slide with the whole piece about employee versus an independent contractor. The federal government is stepping up enforcement on 1099, and the bottom line is there's no such thing as a 1099 employee. The qualifications to truly represent or be working for someone as an independent contractor are so strict and so stringent. There are issues about how many employees are being supervised, how much time is spent in management duties, authority, responsibility for hiring and firing. And the bottom line is very few employees in the dental field truly meet the criteria. There are restrictions that are now being also put on what you can search and information you can get for background checking and reference checking. And the primary stipulation is anything that you're looking for must be job related. So for example, if you're doing a background check, it used to be very common that you would always get someone's driving record. But now there's limitations and restrictions on that you can only get the background information about someone's driving record if, as part of this person's job, they will actually be driving on company time or business, maybe from location to location. Similarly, it used to be very common to get background information about someone's bankruptcies or liens or judgments, but you can't do that unless there's a specific job relatedness. So if this person truly handles money in the practice, then the idea, excuse me, of searching their background for that makes sense. A lot of states are working on increases to minimum wage, and so it's just something also to be aware of. There has never been compensatory time, which is taking time off in lieu of being paid overtime in the private sector. It's something that is legal in the public sector, and there is now actually some legislation in the works where it might actually be a legitimate, legalized thing that can be done. Paid family leave and mandatory sick leave is a huge thing that is rolling across the country, and here's just an example of both states, cities, as well as counties that are already putting in mandatory sick leave requirements. And you can see the last one on the list are the feds, because there's even some talk in the House of Representatives about putting in some sort of mandatory sick leave requirements. Guns in the workplace is another hot issue where people are being allowed to bring them in, and there's conceal and carry and open carry. Again, a lot of variation with it, and it's important to know what those are in your state for your dentist, or you consult with someone like us because we have all of this information so that we can support people doing what they need to do to be in compliance. There's also expansion of what's being called or what would be considered a disability. It goes beyond just someone in a wheelchair, and even to a point now that anxiety is considered a disability, which then can obviously have an effect on the practice's workers' compensation insurance. Other evolving trends. There's an expansion of the protected concerted activities. I talked about that just a couple minutes ago, relative to posts on social media, and they're expanding what protections employees can have and activities that they can engage in outside of work and not, again, be disciplined for those things. Obviously, medical marijuana and recreational use of marijuana is expanding. Lots of states, California, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, for example, have all legalized both the recreational use as well as the medicinal use. The tricky part about marijuana use is even for all of these states, relative to workplace enforcement of it, they defer to the feds, and the federal government still considers marijuana a class whichever drug and is completely illegal to use. And so even though you may be with a client who is in a state where recreational marijuana is legalized, it still is enforced in the workplace under the same stipulation and provisions that the federal government has. There is also a continuing further erosion of the at-will prerogative. A lot of dentists are running around thinking that they practice in an at-will state, and because the definition of at-will says, well, I can terminate anyone anytime I want, with or without notice and with or without cause, therefore I can pretty much do anything I want and I'm okay. Well, that's not true. Because there is also, within the whole employment arena, this group of protections that employees have that are called protected classes. And these are groups of individuals in the workplace that have protections from being discriminated against based on age, based on sex, race, national origin, religion, based on being pregnant. There is also protections in the workplace from being retaliated against. There's protections from harassment. And all of these protections supersede at will. They, in a sense, come before at will. So it's being further eroded. There is clearly an evolutionary trend toward digital records and automation and going more paperless in the HR world, and as well as then protection of that. You read about all these issues of not only hacking in the cyber situation, but also break-ins and identity theft. So the same sort of protections of records and employment personnel files is being ratcheted up also. Assessments are being used more and more, personality assessments for job matching and job placement. I'll talk a little more about that as we go along here. And clearly a big evolving trend is the fact that we've got a multi-generational workforce. In fact, right now, there are 5 different generations in the workplace. The oldest is typically referred to as the silent generation, and you can see that that makes up a very, very small percentage of the U.S. workforce. The interesting thing to note is just some of the key commonalities or characteristics of that generation. The next one is the baby boomers, which we all hear about and have certainly read about for years and years. Baby boomers currently make up about 27% of the workforce, but you can see that they are retiring actually at a rate of about 10,000 per day. So that percentage is clearly going down. Now, it's still going to be there for a while because all told there were about 72 million baby boomers at the time. So even at 10,000 a day, it'll still take a while for all the baby boomers to get to a point of retirement. You can also see some of the other basic generational characteristics that are similar among the baby boomer generation. Next, we have Gen X. And Gen X right now makes up about 35% of the U.S. workforce. You can see, again, some of those characteristics. The third one down there is they seek balance between work and family. This whole idea of work-life balance, Gen X had that dialed in, where baby boomers and certainly the silent generation were more the workaholic type characteristics of that generation. Gen Y, or the millennials, is the one that is making up now the highest percentage and will continue to grow over the next few years. Again, you can look right there at some of the key characteristics of that. And the newest generation is Gen Z. These are the people under 20. Obviously, currently they don't make up a whole big percentage of the workforce, but this is coming. And it's important in that process to, again, understand issues like, well, these people just use Twitter. These people don't know a world without smartphones and without texting. and without Snapchat. Now, relative to generations, it's important also when we look at the big three of baby boomers, Gen X, and Gen Y, of some of these generational differences. And here's a few that I just want to point out: this idea of the view of the future, the idea of a view of technology, and certainly about change. Now, there's a whole lot that has been talked about and presented about these different generations and how to navigate it. And a lot of times it's put in this context of certain generations are better, or, oh, these people are bad because they think a certain way or they do a certain way. The key is to just know that this is real, they're all out there, and the reality is there are ways to connect with employees across all of the generations. And there are a lot of studies that have shown that these key 7 values are ones that matter to most of the workers in all of these different generations. And so then, instead of trying to say, okay, well, how do I treat a millennial and how do I treat a baby boomer, you can say, what if I focus on these 7 values, which are ones that are similar with the generations. And of course, if we're talking about a workforce that has a multi-generational component to it, you can't talk about that without also talking a little bit about organizational culture. And the fact is that every organization and every business has a culture. And of course, the question is the culture that this organization has, is it one by default or one by design? If there's not a question about whether it has one, it does have one. And is it there just by accident and by happenstance, or has there been some actual thought and some proactive work done on creating the kind of culture that will work? A lot of this has to do with personality. There are elements like, is it formal? Is it more informal? Is it more rule-based? Is it more laid back? There are lots of aspects that deal with designing and creating the organizational culture that will work best. And there isn't just one for all dental offices, because it does have a lot to do with a reflection of the values of the dentist, the leader, the practice owners, as well as the makeup of the employees that are there. Now, that all being said, the second key question that must be asked about any organizational culture is, do you want your employees to think or not think? There are cultures where the culture is about don't think. And the biggest example of that is the military. In the military, you're not supposed to think. You are supposed to just follow the rules. And sometimes dentists want their organizations to be just like that, where they don't want their employees to think, they just want them to do what the dentist says. But so the second question is, do you want your employees to think or not think? Now, my feeling is that because a dental office is truly in the customer service business, there really is only one cultural option as it relates to thinking or not thinking. And it's got to be one where you want your employees to think. Because every day in a dental practice, as you all well know, there are 10, 15, 20 times in any given day when an employee needs to make a decision about something. And unless the dentist wants every single decision about Mrs. Smith, who wants to know if the payment can be broken into 2 payments instead of all being paid right now, or any other questions like that, unless the dentist wants to be hit with those things all the time, well, then you've got to have employees who are willing to think, and think within the context of the practice's vision and mission, purpose, and values. A lot of you do great work with your clients about, especially on the front end, in establishing a relationship with them about the practice's vision based on the practice's values. And that is hugely important, because now that becomes the framework with which decisions are made. So when a decision is made, we can say, is that decision in alignment with the vision that we have, the brand we have, what we put out that we are committed to doing and delivering? And you'll notice there that there's another key component, because when we allow people to think, then the reality is there will be some mistakes made, but mistakes at that point are viewed more as an opportunity for learning and growth, an opportunity for discussing why was that decision made, and in the context of our vision in the future, what might be a better decision to make. So the new paradigm as it relates to organizational culture and as it relates to HR is employees are paid to think. And when employees are valued for their brain, they stay. They feel valued. They stay, they're more committed, and they're more engaged. So back to our list of evolving trends. We have this piece I just mentioned about multi-generational workforce and culture and how to sort of navigate some of that in a more successful way. And relative to our existing employees, we've had this whole issue of performance management. Relative to performance management, just know annual performance review, that old traditional performance review, that's dead. And it's being replaced and has been replaced with individual goals. Now, why is it dead? Well, first question is, how many people absolutely positively love performance reviews? And the reality is pretty much only masochists do. Number two, how many do them because they've heard they should or they ought to or they must? And people say, okay, well, that might be true if they're done well, but then let's look at the statistics. 1 in 5 employees think their bosses don't even think about the appraisal until they're in the room. 44% don't think their boss is honest. 87% found them to be ineffective, and 94% of the chief executives responded the same way. And look at this. 30% of performance reviews end in decreased employee performance, the exact opposite of what you otherwise are wanting to accomplish. 58% of bosses say they don't think it's an effective use of their time. So given these stats, what conclusions do you draw? Well, I think if you're like me, we kind of say, ew, this isn't working so well. And what about this idea of protection? Here's a quote from an article that was written by an attorney, Judith Keys. And you can see in 35 years of practice, she can count on one hand the performance review was a significant help. And she says even in those, the employer's position would have likely been strong even without it. So in 35 years, on one hand, so less than 5 times. And look at this. In writing this article, she did a search. There were 40 decisions where the performance review was cited, and it was cited not by the dentist, it was cited by the employee's attorney to justify the employee's claim. So when they're not done well, then they get used against you. So what conclusions do you draw? Well, they're not being done well, and they're not working very effectively. And of course, we're all familiar with Albert Einstein's quote of the definition of insanity, and we just keep doing the same thing over and over and somehow expect a different result. It is just insanity. So why individual goals? Well, specifically, it's to support employee engagement. And the higher the employee engagement, the lower the turnover. And with a growing economy, you can't be a consultant, you can't be an owner of a practice, a leader of people, a manager of people, and not be concerned about employee engagement. And when I say there about a growing economy, just understand that as the economy is growing, what that produces is a tighter labor market. And it becomes harder and harder, more challenging, to find good people. We know of consultants who specialize simply in the recruiting and hiring, and they are saying that there are dentists who call from certain parts of the country, and they tell these dentists they're not even going to work with them because of how difficult it is already finding quality employees in those particular areas. And there are areas, of course, where the economy is particularly hot right now. So as this grows, the focus has to be more on how do I support performance management and retention of people through counseling, through training, through mentoring. Now, if I pull away from HR and I talk about something you all are really familiar with, well, that's this whole world of recall. What's better for a practice to do? Take their recall system or recare system and tighten it up so it's more and more effective, or should I just go out and spend $100,000 on a marketing plan and bring in a whole bunch of new patients? Well, it doesn't do me a whole lot of good to bring in a whole bunch of new patients if my recall system has so many gaps and holes in it that I just lose these people. So I invest all this money, I bring them in, but I don't have the long-term retention. Same sort of analogy for employees. If I do a good job at recruiting and hiring with implementing assessments, background checks, behavioral-based questions, well, now the focus is what can I truly do to retain these people over time and support practice success. And goals becomes a huge way of doing that because you sit down with people and you really talk about ideas and thoughts that they have about how they can bring about improvement in the practice. Those become goals. They become authored by the individual, and anytime there's a pride of ownership with something that is put out, the likelihood that a person will accomplish those things or follow through clearly are a lot higher. Now, when it comes to engagement, Gallup has done much of the groundbreaking research with it, and their research is that today's workforce, 29% of employees are engaged. I mean, 29% are actually really plugged in. 54% are not engaged at work. They're there, but it's like that classic thing of lights are on, but no one's home. And the really scary one, 17% are actively disengaged. They really don't care. And there is some sabotage going on, and there's where the rumor is and backbiting that undermines the work that you're otherwise attempting to do. So when you look at these statistics, clearly any and everything that can be done that can support increased engagement would be huge. In addition to that, 79% of employees who quit, they cite a lack of appreciation for the reason for leaving. If you ask dentists, why do people quit? Almost all dentists are going to say it's because of money. It's not. It's because of some kind of misunderstanding or lack of appreciation. People may say it's because of money because they don't want to, in a sense, be vulnerable about the real reason. And 65% of North Americans report that they received little to no recognition or appreciation at work in the past. That is pretty scary. When 65% are saying little to no recognition or appreciation. The consequences of a lack of recognition or appreciation, there's employee turnover, poor attendance and productivity. Patient and customer service suffers. There's poor relationships among the team. Again, that's backbiting and sabotage and rumor stuff. It contributes to an overall negative morale and a negative organizational culture. One of the other pieces back to our evolving trends is more results-based compensation. And that's basically bonus and incentive plans. Chuck Blakeman wrote the book, Why Employees Are a Bad Idea. And the whole piece is this idea of creating stakeholders versus employees. And the reality is when people have some skin in the game, they have more commitment and they have psychic ownership in supporting the long-term success of the practice. And so we're seeing bonus and incentive plans becoming more the norm rather than the exception. So those are a number of the evolving trends that are important, I think, to be aware of. Now, relative to addressing all of these, the way we look at it is there are 5 HR pillars that must be in place. The first one is a policy manual, and you can call it a policy manual, you can call it an employee handbook. It needs to obviously be updated and current. Now, why? Well, it establishes the expectations, and it establishes the expectation for everyone to have the same expectations. This is about the policies that are required by law, the ones that make good common business sense, as well as discretionary ones. And it supports, like it says there, everyone being on the same page through communicating the culture and the values and the philosophy of the practice. It treats people consistently, so you're avoiding issues of discrimination. There's obviously compliance with state and federal and county and city laws, and the real beauty of having a great policy manual is it reduces the answer to virtually any and all questions to just 5 magic words. All your dentist needs to say when an employee says, oh, you know, Labor Day happened and I don't know, do we get paid for Labor Day or not, or January or July 4th landed on a Wednesday, so is that a paid one? Or you just say these 5 words. Go look in the manual. And whether the manual is online or whether the manual is printed out, the answer is still the same. It's just go look in the manual. If a dentist does that, and the dentist has a good, comprehensive, up-to-date manual, then the dentist can rest assured knowing that, number 1, the answer is there. Number 2, the answer is correct. And number 3, by doing this, they're doing it consistently with everyone, and so indeed everyone is treated fairly. The second of the 5 HR pillars is individual job descriptions, again, updated for each of the positions. It ensures, again, compliance with the federal rules and state regulations. It puts an employer in a position to be able to defend their actions about accommodation or why maybe someone was let go. It supports a recruiting tool because if we have a job description which is this is what the duties and the expectations are of this job, well then our ability to write more effective ads is a whole lot easier. So thus it's identifying the tasks, duties, and responsibilities, and it acts as a communication vehicle. Linda Miles for years has talked about job descriptions as a recipe, almost like a recipe for success. It's how to bake a cake. We use these ingredients, and it's a tablespoon of this and a teaspoon of that. Well, a job description just delineates the duties and the expectations and the responsibilities of the job. And you can see at the bottom there it talks about ADA compliant. And of course, in the HR world, ADA does not stand for the American Dental Association. It stands for Americans with Disabilities Act. And it's this whole piece about looking at the essential functions unique to this particular position. Job descriptions make it easy to identify training needs and where the gap needs to be filled with a person, whether it's an existing employee or even a new employee. And it becomes the basis for the goal setting and therefore the performance management and the reviews on an ongoing basis, and they support staff accountability. So those are some of the keys for job descriptions. The third pillar is personnel forms, and this is the whole piece about documentation. We all know in the real estate world, when they talk about real estate, they say the most important thing is location, location, location. Well, in the HR world, it's documentation, documentation, documentation. Because remember one of those statistics that I shared early on, if a dentist gets into a dispute with an employee and it turns out to be the dentist's word versus the employee's going to win over 87% of the time. Why documentation? First of all, you want it to objectively outline the deficiencies so it takes the emotion out of it. It sets expectations for improvement. It warns of potential consequences. It certainly may include termination. It includes signatures so the employee doesn't ever get to say, I never knew, or I was never told, or that's not true. And of course, good documentation shows that there is a pattern where there was opportunity given to the employee to improve or change, and that there was an inability to do that. Relative to documentation in the HR world, and specifically in dental offices, every employee should have a regular file, every employee should have a confidential file, and then there should be the I-9 file or folder with all of the I-9 forms in it. And this supports it being easily organized and maintained and ensuring that you're retaining the records given the requirements of length of time that the various records need to be retained. In the world of HR, have this watertight documentation. You need about 70 forms, obviously an application and a reference checking form. There can be a direct deposit form. There's disciplinary forms. There's leave of absence forms. So any for real HR department has about 70 forms. Obviously, what we do with our clients is we provide them with the 70 forms. They're all online that then they have readily available to use based on the circumstance or situations that come up. The fourth pillar is compliance alerts and updates, because it doesn't do us a whole lot of good to have gotten into compliance 3, 5, 7 years ago and not kept up with things. And in some regards, that may even be worse than doing nothing at all, because now I'm literally governing or managing with outdated and incorrect information. So it's critical to stay up to date and current. And of course, the fifth pillar is then having access to ongoing HR specialist support, so that as questions or issues come up, there is a resource that an office can turn to get their issues addressed or their questions answered. Now, what are dentists doing out there? Well, some of them try to do it themselves, and in that regard, they don't necessarily know what they need, because this is not something that's taught in dental school. They don't often keep everything current and up to date because they don't have the time, or they don't know exactly how best to go about doing that. And so, is this the best use of their time? And I think you would conclude with me that probably not. They also hire a staff person, or just assign this task to a staff person. Again, is this person someone who is credentialed in HR? Is this someone with certifications in HR? If a truly HR professional is hired, the going annual salary is in the $50,000 to $100,000 range. And so for a dental office, is this the best use of their money? Probably not. The third option that dentists employ in terms of trying to do this is they hire an attorney. They hire an attorney. Oftentimes they won't even use an attorney that has a specialty in dentistry or labor law, which obviously there are unique things about the industry, and if they're going to hire an attorney, it should be someone who has a specialty in labor law and a lot of experience in the dental field. The going rate for attorneys to draft a policy manual is about $5,000 these days. That doesn't include job descriptions or forms. The manual is good for a year, or as soon as some rules and laws change, and thus then the client is paying some amount of money for each additional change. And then you can ask yourself, is this cost effective or smart? And of course, the other question that you ask yourself is, so dentists are doing it themselves, or assigning it to a person who may or may not have any knowledge or experience with it, or know much more about it than the dentist does, or they're hiring an attorney. So how is it working? Well, remember at the outset when I talked about some of the trends that are going on, and I think we can conclude that in many, many cases, it's not working very well. The fourth alternative or option for a dentist is to partner with or co-source with an HR firm. Obviously, as you guys all know, that's what we do. When clients partner with us, it means that they're effectively getting a high-valued employee without the cost of hiring a full-time HR person. So it becomes really the easiest and most cost-effective way to do it, and supports their ability to focus just on dentistry. Working with a HR firm like us does not preclude them having a staff person do this, because again, with the trend of offices creating groups, and we end up with maybe 5 or 7 or 12 locations with 50 or 100 employees, well, there may be a point where there might need to be an HR manager on staff, but that person's focus becomes more about managing, not doing the grunt work in terms of applicable rules and laws. So in those situations, we still do, let's call it the heavy lifting for them in terms of the rules and the laws and the compliance, freeing up their HR managerial time to focus more on retention, performance, and recruiting and hiring. I want to leave you with some cautions, and from an HR standpoint, one of the cautions is there are companies out there that lease employees, and dentists sometimes think that this just gets them off the hook if there's someone else providing the employees. There are also organizations called PEOs, which stands for Professional Employer Organizations, that also provide the employees and say they will manage the employees. And again, dentists think, oh good, this headache is now gone and I don't have to worry about it. There are also payroll services doing HR, and the tricky part here is payroll services are really good about doing payroll, but not necessarily as good about doing HR. It makes sense for them to do that because they want just a product line extension, but it just puts them out attempting to provide something that really is not their area of expertise. The cautions in all this is that even with leased employees or PEOs, there is still a shared liability. So for the dentist thinking that they get off the hook with issues like harassment or discrimination or all the other labor-related potential claims, it's not true. It becomes a shared liability, and so there is a number of things that will still bounce back on the dentist. And in a lot of cases, if you read the fine print of the leased employees and the PEO type agreement, you will find that there is limited or no recourse back to that company for liabilities that come up as a result of things that took place in the practice. So just know that this idea of leasing employees and PEOs and payroll services doing HR is not the sort of escape that some people might want to wish it was or think that it was. So takeaways for you tonight. Number one, recognize that employees are a resource. They're not an expense. And HR success is really about risk management, and it's about asset protection. These requirements are going to continue to increase in the future. They are not going to be going down. As growth happens, obviously you have to pay attention to employee thresholds and what rules and regulations now may have applicability, and they have to, any of your clients have to simultaneously navigate, as we talked about, federal, state, county, and city regulations. It is so important, and even more important today, given our expanding economy and the labor environment, to focus time and energy on creating an organizational culture that supports customer service and obviously supports the practice's vision, and you hire employees who can think. You pay employees to think, not just follow the rules. Embrace employee engagement and individual goals to enhance performance management and employee retention, and consider implementing and working with your practices to put in results-based compensation, bonus, and incentive plans to support this idea of people being stakeholders and having a psychic interest in the success of the practice. And be cautious, like I said right at the end, about leasing employees and PEOs. So resources from us, we're available to support you and help you and your clients from an HR standpoint. We've got a 4-minute HR assessment in a paper version and an online version that you can do. You can either have your clients do, or you can do this interactively with your clients. We also have a risk analysis, which can be done, again, in paper version or an online version. One of the services we provide is we do policy manual reviews. So if there's someone who has a policy manual and they're just wondering what it's like, is it good, is it bad, is it in compliance, out of compliance, we'll do a policy manual review for them. If after doing that review, they opt to invest in our online HR system, which is called the HR Director, then in the money that they spend on the policy manual review, we apply to the investment in the HR director. So in that way, the policy manual review doesn't even cost them anything at all. Our online HR system, the HR director, provides a policy manual, an employee handbook, all the forms, job descriptions, support with hiring and recruiting, as well as performance management. All of the 70 forms that we talked about. We keep everything current and up to date for them. So we're tracking their state, we're tracking the number of employees and keeping everything up to date. And then we've got HR specialists on staff who are fielding calls every day from, you know, any number of our thousands of clients who might call in with some question. And it might be something like, hi, one of my employees informed me today that she's pregnant and I haven't had to address a pregnancy leave thing for 5 years, and so what do I need to do? And we just walk them through the process. Our system works for single locations, multi-locations. It works also if there's a practice that crosses state lines. We are the exclusive provider of Drake P3 assessments in the healthcare field, which is an assessment tool that can be used for hiring and job matching and job selection, as well as performance management and team building. We provide a service that does background checks, so it makes the checking for background information and the job relatedness really painless and easy. We have a bonus and incentive software program. It's called Bonus Pro. Again, it runs online. It uses absolutely proven methodologies for how it runs. It takes 15, maybe 20 minutes, depending upon the size of the practice, each month to do once it's all set up. So it is a wonderful way. You can obviously learn more about us via our website. You can email us at info, and then there's our toll-free 800 number there. So that's the formal part of tonight's webinar. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that anyone has.
Tim, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I don't see any questions, although I've typed in our message box that if you have any questions, please send them to you. And I don't see any questions, but what I thought maybe you could share with us as consultants is what can we do other than have our clients sign up with your program? Is there something that we can do personally for ourselves to make ourselves more knowledgeable?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have ways that consultants can engage with us. I mean, one is you can just say, okay, I just want to know that Bent Erickson is there as a resource, and I'm just going to refer my people and just know they're going to be well taken care of. So we're available as a resource for you to refer to, and we typically extend a small discount to them on your behalf so that you kind of look good in the process. There's also engagement where you can actually represent the HR director and the sale of the HR director, and if that's the case, there's commission monies in there. And then you can also engage in a way through a program we call BOP certification. I noted with some of the folks on the line tonight, Kathy Asted was on and Robin Basotis was on, and they are BOP consultants with us. And so this means, and Ben Bradley's on, he's also a BOP consultant with us. This means they can not only represent the HR director and they can sell it, but they can also do the implementation. And they do the implementation for those clients they're working with, but as we end up with clients all throughout the country, then they do some of that implementation work on our behalf. And so what it actually represents is an additional revenue stream opportunity for those consultants. That requires what's called a certification process with us, which is a series of some classes and webinars and obviously some tests and some mock personalization so that we feel that the level of competency and representation is at a point that then you are, for all intents and purposes, representing us with both your clients as well as other clients. And we are just in the process of a completely new, updated version of our HR director, where we will be coming out with a new revised certification program. And for those people who are interested in that, I mean, we'll get information out, obviously, through the ADMC network, but people who are interested in that, they can email us or let us know, and we can certainly get you plugged into that information as it's available.
Well, that's great. You're certainly a wealth of information, and you're offering an awful lot of opportunities for us to get our clients involved, or we can get involved directly. So, Tim, I just want to thank you so much for such an informative evening. Thank you for your time. This was a great webinar. Thank you, Tim.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
And good night to all of you.
Good night, everybody.